good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. I'm John Caldwell from the Kirby Institute Global Health Program. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this regular seminar in our Kirby Institute seminar series, and this is in the sub group of seminars that are labelled as Global Health. I'd like to first acknowledge traditional owners. I'm speaking to you from Hobart, and acknowledge the Palawa people, this part of Australia, and acknowledge traditional owners all over Australia, in fact, elsewhere. It's a particular pleasure this morning or this afternoon to welcome our speaker, Sinead Delany-Moretlwe, who is a Director of Research at the Wits RHI, which is a really major research, multidisciplinary research institute in Johannesburg in South Africa. We've had the pleasure of collaborating with Sinead and Wits RHI for the last, I think, six years or so on looking at the impact of the human papillomavirus vaccine, which is a topic of great importance globally. But today, Sinead is going to be focusing on a topic that she's really taken a substantial leadership through a number of trials in relation to HIV prevention. HIV has far from gone away, and prevention is as important now as it has ever been. As I said, Sinead is the Director of Research at Wits RHI, and in that capacity has led a number of international trials and national trials. And today we'll be giving us an update on where we're up to with the new and recently developing and evolving biomedical prevention technologies to prevent HIV infection. Sinead's joining us from her own time zone, where it's 5 a.m. in Johannesburg. So I really appreciate you taking the time and making the effort to do that, Sinead. I don't know if it's your regular starting time, but we're very grateful that you could get up in the middle of winter and contribute to this seminar series. So over to you, and just to remind you, the participants in the seminar, please put your questions in the Q&A, and when Sinead has finished the presentation, about 45 minutes or so, we will have time for some questions for her. Thanks, Sinead, over to you.
Thanks very much, John, for that kind introduction, and good morning or good afternoon to all of you. All right, so I'm going to talk to you about the rollout of new HIV prevention technologies, and this was just to acknowledge that this was a presentation that was previously given at a meeting earlier this year. And the first thing that I'd like to do is just to start by getting a sense of where we are in terms of oral PrEP access. So it's pretty much been over a decade since we had the first evidence of the efficacy of pre-exposure prophylaxis. And PrEP is now a fairly mainstream additional option for people who are at higher risk of HIV. And its access has been, and uptake has been increasing over the last few years, despite the global COVID pandemic. So by Q2 of this year, about 2.2 million people are estimated to have initiated oral PrEP worldwide. Although this is fairly significant scale up, the scale up is concentrated probably in 3 countries: the USA, South Africa, Kenya, and I should include Australia. And so much of that scale up is fairly limited to those countries, and access elsewhere is somewhat constrained, which is one of the reasons that we failed to meet the global target of 3 million on PrEP by 2020, despite evidence of impact on incidence in many of the settings where there has been scale up of both PrEP and antiretroviral therapy. So another challenge with the scale up of oral PrEP is really the issue of persistence. And this is data from a study that we were involved in South Africa and Kenya, really looking at uptake and initiation of oral PrEP in adolescent girls and young women. And what you can see is this fairly precipitous decline in persistence over the first 6 months, although about 20% of people who did stop PrEP subsequently reinitiated. But there's been a fair amount written on current challenges to oral PrEP, which are largely related to the drug itself, so to people complaining about side effects, complaining about the pill size, or just the burden of taking a pill a day. And then there are health systems issues really related to the cost of accessing health services or traveling to health services, as well as just the visit burden on people who are essentially healthy having to attend.
Sorry to interrupt. It's just been brought. I mean, I just realised that we can actually see your notes. I don't quite know why.
Okay. Okay. Better?
Yes. Thank you very much. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay. Sorry about that. The last thing is that there are social and contextual issues, which mean that many people who access PrEP experience stigma and discrimination, either because their pills are mistaken for antiretroviral therapy, or because they're judged for being sexually active. And in many parts of the world where the burden of gender-based violence is high, that means that many people may be disinclined to continue PrEP if they are concerned about threats of partner violence. And then substance use for mental health and the COVID pandemic have really meant there are many challenges to people taking a pill a day, which is why we need a range of PrEP options that can fit into people's lifestyles and over their life course as their needs change. So what I want to talk to you today really are about the options that lay ahead, and those new PrEP agents that are likely to become part of our health programs in the next year or two. The first of those is the Dapivirine vaginal ring. And this is a flexible silicone ring that's been developed by the International Partnership for Microbicides. A woman can insert the ring monthly into her vagina, and because it is essentially located topically, there's low systemic absorption of drug. It's considered acceptable by those who use it and doesn't interfere with sex. About 5 years ago, 2 phase 3 trials showed that it was well tolerated and reduced HIV risk in women by about 30%. Those 2 trials went on to conduct open label extensions, and there they showed that use was increased once people were aware of efficacy. And in a counterfactual assessment, they estimated that the ring reduced HIV risk by about 50%. Essentially meant is that the ring was then adjudicated by the EMA to they gave a favorable opinion for the use of the ring for HIV prevention, and this led to WHO pre-qualification. And the reason that that's important is that it allows then for the procurement of the ring by many low and middle income countries for inclusion in their programs. What followed about a year ago is that WHO then included new clinical recommendations where they recommended that the Dapivirine ring be offered at sites where oral PrEP was available as an additional HIV prevention measure. And so there is somewhat of a caveat with that recommendation, because there is a recognition that there may be variable efficacy, but for people who are not able to use oral PrEP, the ring is recommended as an additional option. And so as a result, there have been a number of regulatory submissions in particularly sub-Saharan Africa, and approval was obtained in Zimbabwe last year and in South Africa in March this year. And additional approvals are being sought in a range of countries that have high burdens of HIV in the region, as well as more generally. So there are some data gaps. And the first of those is really that we have limited data on the safety in pregnancy and breastfeeding. Now, we don't have any reasons to think that there would be toxicities in pregnancy and breastfeeding. The preclinical studies didn't give any indications of reproductive toxicity concerns, and nor were any adverse events seen in pregnancy or infants during the phase 3 trials. But the numbers included in those studies were fairly small. And it's going to be important to have data on this population so that the ring can be used in populations of reproductive potential. So there are 2 studies that are ongoing that are essentially collecting safety data. The first of those is the DELIVER study, which has looked at the safety and acceptability of the Dapivirine ring in pregnant women. It's being conducted in 4 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and essentially is looking at rolled back cohorts. So from the last trimester through to the early trimesters of pregnancy, really to assess safety in that population. And then there is another study which has been completed called Be Protected, which is in lactating people. And the results are expected to be presented round about now. So just to, it's really important that these data are accrued, and you may have heard of the call to action about the inclusion of pregnant and breastfeeding women in the accelerated access to antiretrovirals. And this is because we know that many people who may be at risk for HIV may also wish to safely conceive. So the other group that the EMA said they required more data on was really the group of 18 to 24-year-olds. And this was in part because in the trials, no protective benefits of the ring were seen in the age group 21 years and younger, partly because of poor adherence. And so additional data is sought in this group. And some of that data was presented earlier this year at CROI with the findings from the REACH study, which enrolled just under 250 young women aged 16 to 21 from Uganda, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. And they used an interesting crossover design where participants were allocated to first oral PrEP or the ring in sequence, and then crossed over. And then this was followed by a choice period. Importantly, no safety concerns were observed with either product, and participants found both products highly acceptable. But what's interesting is those that were assigned the ring initially actually chose the ring in the subsequent choice period. And what's important as well is that for both agents, adherence was better than in previous studies, giving us some insights into the level of support that's really needed to support adolescents to adhere to PrEP agents. So how do we go really from trials to programs? There has been a global action plan that has been developed to support the ring introduction, and that relies on a number of processes, including the regulatory processes that I've talked about, as well as the national regulatory approvals. But then there's also work to support the supply chain. And this has really been important, given that the ring was developed by IPM as a nonprofit. They've had to seek manufacturing capacity that would really meet global demand. And part of that requires really forecasting demand. And I'll talk a little bit about that. The other thing is that there has been a need to support national policy and identify sort of what systems are needed by governments to introduce the ring. And then the last piece is really around demand creation and engagement with civil society in generating interest in ring access. So I think critical to the introduction of these new agents are discussions around cost and cost effectiveness. And one of the sort of big considerations at the moment is the cost for procurement. IPM is marketing the Dapivirine ring as at a cost of about $13 to $15 for donors and national government programs. There is a belief, so that's kind of $15 for 12 rings in a year. There is a belief that when the 90-day ring is developed, that may reduce costs, but for the moment, that's the price to the public sector, with the idea that there should be no cost to the end user when it's introduced within a public sector setting. Now, the modeling and cost-effective analyses suggest that for the Dapivirine ring, delivery costs could be lower than they are currently for oral PrEP, because there's a lower requirement for monitoring. So because it is topically absorbed. But currently the models to date have really given us a wide range of estimates of what the impact would be. So ranging from 11% up to 132% more impact than oral PrEP alone. due in part to the really considerable uncertainty about what demand will be and what that will mean for uptake, but also persistent use and ultimately effectiveness. And it's going to be important really to have real world delivery data through implementation science projects to refine those estimates. But there are some challenges to that, in that, for example, the FDA declined to review the dossier on the ring, and PEPFAR, which is US government funded, now has challenges with including the ring in its procurement requests, meaning that access may be constrained. So there's a lot of work to do really to demonstrate that this would be a useful addition to national programs. And certainly future analyses are going to need to consider, in addition, the additional costs associated with offering choice. So our HIV prevention programs are fairly naive at how to offer a range of options, unlike, for example, contraception. But even with contraception, what we are confident about is that we have agents that have very similar efficacy. So we're really talking about side effect profiles. Whereas with HIV prevention, the conversations may be more challenging. And then we also have to consider the cost of different delivery models that are aimed at maximizing coverage. Really, we will be constrained in terms of delivery potentially if the ring has to be offered at sites that offer oral PrEP. So all is not a smooth road ahead, but certainly important questions to address. Just to highlight the fact that there are a number of demonstration projects that are planned in sub-Saharan Africa, funded by a range of donors, including USAID and UNITAID and potentially PSI. And these programs are really critical to answering questions that are somewhat unknown about how best to generate demand, what the acceptability is going to be in key population groups, what delivery models are best, whether fixed or mobile delivery sites offer any advantages, how to train the healthcare providers in offering choice, and also how to integrate these agents into a comprehensive sexual and reproductive health package, as well as how to conduct monitoring and evaluation, particularly around persistence of PrEP. So now I'm going to switch gear and talk about another prevention agent, which you may have heard a fair amount about, and that is cabotegravir. So cabotegravir is a long-acting injectable agent. It's an integrase inhibitor. And there were two trials that demonstrated that Cabotegravir is generally safe and effective as PrEP. The first of these trials was the HPTN-083 trial. This was a trial that involved cisgender men and trans women who have sex with men. It enrolled just over 4,500 participants, and participants were drawn from the Americas, South Africa, Thailand, and Vietnam. That trial was stopped early, and results presented in May 2020 showing that people who received cabotegravir had a 66% lower risk of HIV compared to those who were receiving Truvada. Those results were followed about 6 months later with the results from the HPTN-084 trial, which was also stopped at an interim review. The 084 trial enrolled cisgender women predominantly aged 18 to 45, just over 3,200 participants from 20 sites in 7 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And there we saw even more impressive results, with women in the cabotegravir arm having an 88% lower risk of HIV compared to those in the Truvada arm. So, as I mentioned, both of these trials were stopped prematurely for efficacy at interim reviews. One of the sort of earlier observations was that incidence was low across both arms of the trial, so both PrEP agents were effective, but it's likely that cabotegravir was more effective because of the adherence advantage that it offered over Truvada. So since then, we've seen those 2 trials present additional data, which I think provides reassurance. The first of the sort of additional lessons or emerging evidence on cabotegravir is data that was presented earlier this year at CROI, showing that the protective effects of CAB were essentially sustained over additional follow-up time. And so the risk reduction of 66% was maintained in the first year after the unblinded period. And there were no additional safety concerns identified. And in the 083 trial, the majority of CAB infections were really considered due to injection delays or time off cabotegravir. So one of the things that we are learning from cabotegravir, and I think will be relevant to any new long-acting agents, is really the impact of these powerful antiretrovirals on conventional HIV diagnostics. What we know now is that cabotegravir is able to suppress viral replication, and as a result, it leads to delays in antibody production. And one of the concerns that has arisen is with delays in diagnosing HIV, people who are HIV infected may have been exposed to prolonged monotherapy, and that this could lead to integrase resistance in rare cases. And just to say that that is a fairly rare event, but some cases have been observed. What's been reassuring to know is that that resistance can be overcome by other non-INSTI heart regimens, but obviously that generates anxiety in places like sub-Saharan Africa, where our programs are largely, our treatment programs are where dolutegravir is the cornerstone of those programs. So one of the things that has been discussed is whether the use of a sensitive HIV RNA assay may help with detection of early infection and prevent resistance. But again, this may not be feasible in programs. And so there's a lot of discussion at the moment about what the optimal testing strategy should be. Again, not to forget or leave pregnant and breastfeeding women behind. Some data were also presented earlier this year in the population of pregnant women who received cabotegravir up until the time of pregnancy diagnosis in the 084 trial. There are about 50 women who were exposed to cabotegravir. As you may recall, in about 2018, there were concerns that dolutegravir might be associated with congenital anomalies, although this fear was subsequently not confirmed. But it was really reassuring to note that there were no congenital anomalies observed in the infants of women who were pregnant in the 084 trial. And also what was important to observe is that residual CAB levels generally were well tolerated during pregnancy, and drug concentrations in terms of tail-phase kinetics were comparable to non-pregnant women. And this is important because we really need to know whether we need dose adjustments in pregnancy. So these give indications really that that may not be required, and have supported the offer of active dosing to pregnant women in the open label extension. So these two trials are ongoing at the moment. They are now offering open label access to cabotegravir through a protocol amendment. What's important in terms of the differences between these open label extensions and the trials is that the protocol amendment now allows the inclusion of adolescents who were previously in a sub-study to have ongoing access to open label CAB. And this has really been important for ensuring licensure for that age group as well. The protocol now allows for an optional oral lead-in. The oral lead-in was originally required in the trials because of uncertainty around the tolerability of CAB, but that's now optional and is also optional in treatment programs. And then because of the concern around diagnosis of HIV, RNA testing has been included as part of the HIV testing algorithm. But I would say it's not believed that this will be required for programs. It's just going to be really important to collect the data to understand the kind of what additional advantages RNA testing might in fact offer. And then for the 084 study, it now includes relaxed contraceptive requirements, so women are not required to use a long-acting reversible contraceptive as they were in the trial, and they have the option to consent for active dosing during pregnancy. And we'll enroll that population and follow them up through pregnancy and breastfeeding, and collect additional safety and pharmacology data in that population. So there are a number of other activities that are ongoing, really based on data from the trials to support implementation decisions. The first of that is additional data will be presented at IAS this year on the sustained safety and efficacy of cabotegravir in women based on the 084 data. There has also been some work really to evaluate viral load platforms for future use for viral load testing, and really whether to explore whether point of care viral load testing is in fact an option. Another area of interest is really whether it's possible to extend the interval between doses from 8 weeks to 12 weeks in order really to provide to create opportunities for alignment with contraceptive visits in women. And that work is partly based on pharmacology assessments, but will also be coupled with a case cohort analysis, which will give us some insights really into what is the threshold of protection, because for the time being, really, there have been pharmacology targets, but the threshold of protection is unknown. And then there is also work to really look at drug-drug interactions between contraceptives in the 084 study and gender-affirming hormones in the 083 study. And while we have not, we don't expect there to be significant drug interactions, it's been important to confirm that as well. So that takes us to really sort of thinking about implementation, and one of the initiatives to support product introduction, based really, I think, on lessons learned from oral prep introduction in these, has been sort of the need for a product agnostic framework, but which has been used, I think, to guide cabotegravir introduction, that can better articulate what the data needs are prior to approval and after approval, and then as part of scale up within LMICs in particular. Really, the work has been divided in addition into those timeframes, also into kind of particular domains that need attention. So what are the issues around manufacturing and distribution? What do we need in the way of clinical research and regulatory approvals in countries? What do we need to know about costing and potential impact? What do we need to know about delivery models and implementation? And here you can imagine that sort of some of these questions relate to HIV testing. And then what do we need to support sort of sustained use? So here I've excerpted really the work that I think has been a lot of focus recently, which is around manufacturing and distribution. And now that we know that cabotegravir is effective, what's needed to ensure adequate access, particularly in high burden settings in sub-Saharan Africa. And this has been something of a hot button issue in the news in the last 6 months, and I'll talk about that, some of the considerations around that shortly. And then just to say that in a number of regulatory submissions have been initiated. We saw approval for cabotegravir by the FDA at the end of last year. We know there are a number of regulatory submissions, including in Australia, taking place or under review at the moment. And WHO has developed its guidance and will launch that at the AIDS conference in Montreal later this month. So there's been a lot in the of discussion really about access. And so it's important to talk about what we know about costs, cost effectiveness, pricing, and then access. And essentially the concerns have been that price may limit access despite the significant benefits that people could gain from access to cabotegravir. And this has been a particular concern in low and middle income countries in sub-Saharan Africa, where benefits are likely to be high, particularly for women who bear the brunt of the epidemic. So there have been 2 cost effectiveness analyses conducted that have highlighted that these incremental benefits that we've seen for cabotegravir over Truvada may not justify large price differentials. The first was data from the US based on the 083 results, and essentially arguing that cab would be value for money if the price was less than $6,000, which to me is a jaw-dropping amount anyway. But essentially it would need to be less than the cost of branded FTDF or FTAF, or half the current costs of cabotegravir, which is about nearly $3,000. So that's the US, and the US has unique health systems challenges, but that's kind of a high-income country setting. The next piece of data really came from what is available as a preprint and has been accepted for publication in the Lancet HIV, is work from South Africa, really based on what we know about the costs of the South African oral PrEP program. And there it's estimated that cabotegravir could avert 3 times more HIV infections and save 3 times more life years, but that the cost of cab per injection would need to be less than twice the cost of the 2-month supply of Truvada for it to be cost effective, which essentially translates to a threshold price of about $100 a year. And just to point out that this would be less than the price that was quoted for the Dapivirine ring, although cab is much more effective than the ring. So it's really clear, I think, that access is going to be constrained unless there's tiered pricing for low and middle income countries. And there's been a lot of discussion, particularly from advocacy groups, about silence over the cost from ViiV Healthcare. Now, in part, that is driven by their uncertainty around demand, and I think the desire from ViiV Healthcare to see what demand will be, particularly in LMICs. But it has led to significant pressure on ViiV Healthcare, who released some statements earlier this year, which created confusion around whether there would be a generic licensing of CAB. This is being corrected, and there have been statements released now that there is a partnership with the Medicines Patent Pool to work towards generic licensing. But I think it's also important to recognize that generic licensing for a nanosuspension is going to be more difficult than generic licensing, say, for tablets like dolutegravir, because the manufacturing processes are much more complex than for pills. And particularly in LMICs, the capacity to do that type of manufacturing needs significant cost outlays. So it's clear that there are going to have to be partnerships and that other partners may be brought into that. But it's an important space to keep an eye on if we're to see sort of access in our region. So there are other implementation considerations to draw your attention to. The first is really that there are questions about how to deliver to specific focus populations. And while the trials did include key populations, there is a belief that there really needs to be more experience in how best to deliver long-acting agents to sex workers and people who inject drugs. And I think underlying that is some anxiety about whether or not people will return for injections on time, and what would happen if they had significant delays between injections in terms of drug resistance. And then I think for trans women, there also needs to be work to identify alternative injection sites. For many people with buttock implants, they were excluded from the trials. And so there's an interest in their alternative sites could be used, and some work around that. There are questions really about models of delivery, how to integrate CAB into existing PrEP programs, whether there are other services where CAB could be offered, and importantly, as I mentioned earlier, how to offer a range of PrEP choices. And then for the long-acting agents, there remains the concern about optimal testing strategies in the context of long-acting agents and how best to minimize the emergence of resistance. And really the graphic just summarizes one of those cases where there were delays in diagnosis and where that led to resistance. So I think the bottom line is that we need an implementation science agenda, and it's great to see that there has been a lot of preparation really to consider introduction studies that include cabotegravir for PrEP. There are many that have already been funded and in fact are in the planning phase, designing their protocols and really getting ready for regulatory approvals in many countries. So a number of studies in Southern and Eastern Africa, but also work to do implementation science studies in Brazil. Some consideration for work to be done in Thailand, given the success of key population-led services there, and in fact also plans potentially to do work in Australia, which will be interesting, as well as in France and West Africa. So a lot of work, and I think if you're interested, the PrepWatch implementation tracker is updated regularly as new groups announce their plans for implementation. So I mentioned earlier the need to support product choice, and I think this is going to be one of the biggest challenges for health services, where choice is not something that's being routinely offered in HIV prevention. And one of the opportunities is really the opportunity to use decision support in a range of healthcare settings. They've been shown in systematic reviews really to improve client knowledge, but also to support values-congruent choices. And I think importantly for PrEP to help with assessing risk. And so there's an idea that PrEP decision tools could really overcome multiple client and provider barriers to PrEP delivery, particularly in resource-constrained settings where often providers don't have time to spend with clients, where in fact they may lack knowledge and where kind of some of the detail they may not have full access to. But also these tools may address the sort of provider-client power disparities that are often present in many of these interactions, and may support more values-congruent options for clients. So we worked on developing a decision support tool with colleagues at the University of Washington, and version 1.0 was evaluated in a randomized controlled trial that was conducted here in Johannesburg. And what we were surprised by is that actually the tool demonstrated twofold higher PrEP continuation rates at month 1 in an adolescent population, which I think sort of is encouraging and suggests that people who make informed choices may be more likely to persist. So what we've gone ahead and done is develop a version 2.0, which includes modules for the Dapivirine ring and for CAB, and are planning additional evaluations in a range of settings, but also have offered the tool to other implementation projects who may use it in a range of settings. So this is something that may be useful, particularly in low and middle income countries. So I just want to finish off by summarizing what I think are the key issues that we need to watch in the next 2 years or so as these agents are introduced. Is the first to recognize that long-acting agents add choice and may overcome PrEP persistence challenges for people who struggle with daily pill taking. Already the ring has several country approvals, has been recommended by WHO, and is likely to be included in demonstration projects, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa this year. That cabotegravir is undergoing regulatory review. It's already been approved by the FDA. WHO will issue guidance this month and will also be included in several demonstration projects likely to start toward the end of this year or perhaps early next year once country approvals are in place. For both of these agents, there are additional questions really about safety and effectiveness in adolescents, pregnant and breastfeeding women, and these are going to be essential really for future implementation so that these populations who are at great risk are not excluded from access. The demonstration projects are really going to address the next set of important questions about access and delivery, but also the potential for impact. And the coverage estimates are really going to, from these demonstration projects, are really going to be important for informing price and cost effectiveness and really ensuring access. So we do need to understand those demand forecasts more clearly. It's going to be important to pay particular attention to the HIV testing approaches for long-acting systemic agents and to monitor what that means potentially for antiretroviral resistance. And decision support tools and other job aids are going to be important for supporting healthcare providers to offer PrEP clients these choices. So with that, I'd like to thank these people who contributed slides or data to this presentation, and I'm happy to take questions.
Well, thank you very much, Sinead, for a perfectly on time and very comprehensive overview. And I'd like to encourage everyone to put their questions into the Q&A. We have a few questions already coming in, and please continue. So maybe just to start, David Regan has just asked about standard oral PrEP. Does that also cause delay in HIV detection? And Andrew Grillick has commented the need for HIV RNA testing is a major impediment, but also Andrew's asked, in settings where HIV RNA diagnosis testing does not occur, as CAB has introduced, are there any plans for monitoring of, and I'm not sure, this is an acronym, I'm not familiar with it, Andrew, INSTI, but I'm sure someone else, I'm sure Sinead knows what INSTI resistance stands for.
Yeah, no, those are great questions. I think the first thing to say is that we have observed some delays in the diagnosis of HIV in the context of oral PrEP, but because oral PrEP is not long-acting, those delays are kind of less substantial than the delays that have been observed with cabotegravir. I think it's important, so with respect to the discussions about HIV testing in the context of cabotegravir and whether we really need RNA, my sense from listening to programs discussing this issue in the region is that they are not going to implement RNA testing. You know, kind of, I think it's important to recognize that, in fact, in the trials, most of the positive tests we saw were false positives. So from the trials, we will be quantifying sort of what, using our testing algorithm, sort of what was the likelihood of sort of missing infections in the context of, in the absence of RNA testing. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that, and most of the implementation projects will just use rapid diagnostic tests. WHO has been looking at sort of the testing issues and whether or not alternative tests should be recommended. But to the point about INSTI resistance monitoring, that is going to be important. It is obviously something that programs will have to do in the same way that they monitored for Truvada resistance. But reassuringly, the modeling data that's being developed suggests that although there may be some losses of benefit, the overwhelming benefits of cabotegravir mean that the risks of resistance are very minor, sort of in terms of the overall impacts.
I've just educated myself on INSTI resistance as you've been answering the question. Now, Felicity Young says it's lovely to see you again. Sends her greetings from her time in South Africa, I guess, or other interactions. And asks a question that I was actually also very interested in the settings of Asia, where HIV risk is very much key populations. How do we? Well, Felicity's asked a question about advocacy. How do we improve advocacy in settings where it's, and in the Asian setting where it is largely key populations at risk of HIV? And I guess that comes down to a lot of the issues you've raised about the drug approval, the approvals, and also the funding mechanisms. And I don't know whether you have some insights into those sort of issues, or how to enhance the likelihood that these strategies will become more available in that setting.
Yeah, I mean, I would absolutely agree that sort of the targeting of CAB is going to be different in different contexts. And I have heard some colleagues in different parts of the world talk about how CAB itself may be used as a second-line agent. But I do think that both of these agents are important additional choices, and sort of we borrowing from the field of contraception and making the case that the more options that are available in a PrEP program, the more likely there is to be uptake of people who will choose agents that really fit into their lifestyle and lead to sort of impacts on population level HIV incidence. I mean, in terms of advocacy, I think sort of the one opportunity at the moment is that there is a lot of momentum around the call to action to increase access to antiretrovirals, but also agents for control of hepatitis and STIs. And I think that's really sort of a global initiative that provides an opportunity to start talking about the need to kind of increase access for pregnant and breastfeeding women, but, you know, kind of by definition, all women who are of reproductive potential. So that may be the place to start having conversations about expanding access to populations.
Thanks. And Virginia Wiseman, who's our health economics lead at the Kirby Institute, has raised a concern about tiered pricing. It says tired pricing in the question, but it says tiered pricing, and is concerned about how that's actually implemented in practice, and pointed out that there's in other settings there's been leakage across different market segments. It's very hard to create those market segments, and both within and between countries, and wondering about your thoughts on how to address that issue more systematically, or at least more effectively.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not, I'm definitely not someone who's kind of working for drug companies, and so don't sort of know, I'm not able to comment on their strategy, but I do think that the prices in high income markets that have been quoted are just unaffordable in low and middle income country settings. So there needs to be some way to ensure that there is access in places where the need is high, and also where the trials have been done. And I think this is kind of what advocates have particularly drawn attention to, is if trials are going to be done in low and middle income country settings, there has to be a foreseeable market. It is also true that a number of taxpayer dollars were invested in these trials. So, you know, kind of this is an argument for why, you know, kind of tiered pricing may also be a barrier for high income countries, where tax dollars have been spent on evaluation and then are being spent really on sort of ensuring access for low and middle income countries. So it's not an easy question. We do know that these long-acting agents are going to be more expensive because of the technology involved in making them, but it's going to be important to sort of continue to have these discussions about price and access in order to ensure that that these agents do have the impact on the epidemic we think they could.
Thanks. I had a couple of so maybe general question I was going to ask you. First of all, about the access to, I guess, standard PrEP and the potential for these new strategies in the setting of South Africa and other high incidence African countries. In terms of the women who are getting access, and cisgendered women, it had often been said that the very young women, and even women in married relationships, are at very high risk of HIV infection. Do you have a sense of how the access is going in the different segments of the population at risk in South Africa, and particularly among younger women? Is it who is likely to, or has access, or who's in a position to access it?
You're talking about oral PrEP, I presume.
Yeah, the standard. I guess where this, standard PrEP that you've talked about, but also where the target is for these new strategies.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things about living in a high incidence setting is it's meant that the government program has essentially expanded to ensure that oral PrEP is available at least in every district in the country. And there has been significant movement despite the COVID pandemic disruptions to ensure good PrEP coverage in most of the country. The program is not really restricted on the basis of behaviors or age, but because it is largely donor funded, there have been strong targets around adolescent girls and young women. I think the challenges to our national program are this issue of persistence. And so there is high interest and uptake, particularly in younger populations, but the ability to sort of take pills daily is often a big challenge, particularly as despite the fact that there has been a lot of demand creation, there is still a lot of stigma around antiretrovirals as pills that are used for treatment. So that is often a barrier to persistence. But I think what it means really for future agents is that there is a national infrastructure. And I think that infrastructure is being developed across the region in terms of access to PrEP. But it may be that sort of as the next steps of introduction are followed, access to other agents will be restricted to implementation sites as part of these demonstration projects. And as health systems gain confidence with delivery, there will be expansion. Some of this has been criticized because there really is an urgency to respond to the HIV epidemic. And we've seen that with COVID, you can mount a response in rapid time when you need it. That's not what we've always seen for HIV. But that is kind of my forecast of how things will probably happen in the next year or two.
Yeah, but I think it is, for those of us who have been around this area for a while, I mean, the Dapivirine ring story goes back at least 20 years, if not more. I can't remember exactly when it was first put on the table, but the original work was at least 20 years ago. And these things it sometimes can seem very far off in the future, but we're at a very different stage now, obviously, with both these agents, and a lot of it really is about the implementation with these very highly efficacious tools, and we're probably past the stage where, again, this is a discussion from a number of years ago, that partial uptake of these prevention tools would be actually worse than not having them worse than not having them at all, because you would be overcompensating with increased risk. Is that discussion still alive, or is that now been put to rest?
My sense that discussion has been put to rest. I mean, there certainly has been evidence from a range of high-income country settings that PrEP introduction has led to substantial reductions in HIV incidence, along with expanded antiretrovirals. Fewer of those analyses are coming from our region, but I think there is a sense that with expanded access to PrEP and a range of choices that we could see those impacts. I think there's certainly a belief that cabotegravir has the potential to overcome many of the challenges that have been experienced with oral PrEP, certainly in the African setting. And what we have are the advantages that particularly many women who bear the burden of the HIV epidemic are experienced with using injectable contraception and find an injection highly desirable. So it's likely that sort of generating demand and uptake is not going to be the issue. I think it's more going to be about sort of the health system's capacity to follow up those people and to kind of navigate the testing challenges that lie ahead.
Andrew Grulich again has come back and pointed out that oral PrEP is now in Australia costing $35 a month, but the cabotegravir is looking at $10,000 a year, which is completely unaffordable in our setting, and let alone in other settings. And so it's not really possible to put on the table as an equal choice, even though that is a desirable goal. It seems to be something that's quite far off in the distance in our settings. And I guess you'll need very substantial funding arrangements to get anywhere near true choice for some of these new technologies.
Yeah, I think that's, kind of, that's what it's boiling down to now. I think it's important for us to continue to support efforts for generic manufacturing, because that will address some of the cost issues. But, it really would be a huge disappointment if having demonstrated the enormous impact of these agents, potential impact of these agents, we're not able to actually use them in the settings or with the populations that need them most.
Sinead, well, we know it's been very early for you, and we really appreciate a fantastic tour de force of your experience and knowledge in this complex area. And on behalf of all of us at the Kirby Institute in Australia, thanks for taking the time to present to us. And I hope that you, I don't know if you go back to bed now or start another busy day, but on behalf of everyone here, thank you very much for your excellent presentation.
Thanks so much. Lovely to talk with all of you.